let's jump into talking about the types of trauma that can show up. And I loved this idea Dr. Deb had of putting them sort of in chronological order. I mean, it makes it a little more linear for us to um, throw a bone to our left brain, right? So we can make it a little easier to get our heads wrapped around this, even though that isn't necessarily for no other reason other than that. So we're just going to begin with like the oldest trauma, and so we'll talk about intergenerational trauma. And that was first introduced to the professional community through looking at the offspring of Holocaust survivors. And so intergenerational trauma can come up, really stem from biology, learned behaviors, and collective trauma. So there are three aspects that I just want to introduce to the conversation. So first with biology, they found that mothers exposed to the Holocaust showed changes in the activity of the DNA segment involved in regulating their stress responses. And interestingly, their children who were not directly exposed showed the same changes for up to 3 generations. We don't have the studies yet. We don't have enough additional generations to show that. But so it's not that it's limited to 3, it's that that's how far the studies have gone so far. So that's very interesting in how it shows up in the biology. In learned behavior, this is talking about the anxiety and worldview of the survivors because children are natural anxiety detectors. They found that when Holocaust survivors who developed a worldview that the world's a dangerous place where bad things can happen at any time, and their children intuitively sense the same fear, that same anxiety. So it's passed on through the learned behaviors. And then the third piece of this we want to introduce is the idea of collective trauma, sometimes called historic trauma. Some indigenous communities call it blood memory. And so this is the impact of the historical events, the colonization, slavery, displacement trauma, like with the First Nations and Native American communities or African Americans, Australian Aboriginals, um, ex entire societies exposed to genocide, ethnic cleansing, or war, like the Cambodians or Rwandans, Palestinians, former Yugoslavians, the descendants of 120,000 Japanese Americans and Japanese nationals who were detained or incarcerated during World War II. So we have this historic collective trauma that Gabor Mate says is part of all trauma, that once something is present, it remains present until it's processed. So we'll be talking today a lot about how that gets brought to the surface and how we can process that. Next, we want to talk about pre-verbal. This is from in the womb to maybe 18 to 24 months old for an infant. And we know, I think it's widely accepted, we all know about the range of the toxic environmental or social pressures that can happen during a pregnancy, right? So that's whether ingesting drugs or alcohol or the stress of living in poverty and all of that that can be transmitted in utero. Um, in my own personal deepest work, I'll share that I was working on issues around my own acceptance and enoughness. And it took me to a pre-birth feeling of not being wanted, of being an unwanted pregnancy, actually, and questioning if life and love was accessible or even available to me. And so it was definitely a pre-verbal experience, right? It was just a body sensing, a body memory of that pre-birth experience. And in my journey, I was able to reconcile that and heal from feeling like being unwanted. So a lighter example that I see a lot in my own day-to-day life is how mothers or fathers, I suppose, it's often moms who fear dogs sometimes pull their hands of their child a little bit closer to them when they see me coming with my vicious labradoodle. So when they don't, sometimes they don't even say anything, right? They clench up or they'll pull back or they'll pull sideways a little bit. And that's felt in the child, of course. Now, because labradoodles look like a giant living teddy bear, the kids often override their mother's fear of dogs. And I don't know, maybe we do a little bit of generational healing by bringing a spoiled dog around in the world. So that's my hope. It's my story, and I'm sticking to it. Um, so so after pre-verbal, it's like now we start getting into the childhood work, um, childhood trauma, and what happens next. By the time we're 3, 4, 5 years old, start getting compared to other kids and start making our way out into the world and discovering it's not all the way we thought it was. So this includes everything from Well, pandemics more recently, right? I mean, imagine, I don't know what it would be like growing up in the last several years as a young child. Sexual abuse, physical abuse, domestic violence, injuries, illnesses, or medical procedures, that sort of thing, community violence, neglect, um, trauma, grief, traumatic grief, right? Like we can talk about the difference between traumatic versus normal grief. It gets very complex very quickly, doesn't it? A victim of a crime or a kidnapping or a bad accident or school violence. I'm thinking even I'm concerned about the threat of school violence, right? Even we used to worry about atomic bombs, right? We would hide under our desk and put our heads in our knees or whatever, that somehow that was going to protect us from an atomic bomb back in the day. And now we're worried about school shootings and just common bullying. That just because it's common doesn't mean it isn't traumatic or traumatizing, or that it can be. So, and loss of any kind, like the loss of a parent. I lost my mother when I was 7, and it's more common, of course, people losing parents or the sense of losing a two-parent household when parents get divorced, and how do children navigate that in the healthiest way possible. And and how do adults now recognize that they're still being directed by these traumas that they might call a small t trauma. Like it's not bad enough to worry about. It's like everybody had divorced parents. It's like, and so I should be over that by now. And we judge ourselves for the small t trauma. Um, and I'll just throw this out here. I'm going to stop using the term small t trauma because I was lucky enough to be at a retreat a couple of weeks ago in Costa Rica with Bessel van der Kolk was the main attraction, and I got to talk to him about that. And I was asking him about the effects of small t trauma on our sense of enoughness, and he very quickly said, "Oh, it doesn't exist because it's not small. Like not having someone to feel like they love you, or someone that you feel wants to be heard, you want to be heard by, or wants to listen to you, that's not a small thing." So it's not about that, and yet it's maybe even more insidious because we dismiss it and we don't ever get to do the work and just let it. It continues to direct our behavior, decisions, and lives. So those are the big things I wanted to cover off the top, and I think then Dr. Deb, you're going to pick us up there and.
Yes, yeah. So I'll talk it. Really, it's
Mhm.
building on kind of what you've been referring to here, Mike, which is the difference between simple trauma and complex trauma. So that simple trauma involves usually just a single event itself, like a flood, an earthquake, a fire. And so that experience and that one event is traumatizing, but it's not a repeated trauma. Although, obviously, with these traumas, like being in a fire, can go on for a long time because you have recovery and building. I know, like here in Colorado, we had the Marshall Fire a couple of New Year's ago, and they're just now getting their homes really built, so that's a big delay. So it's like been a several year process with that one fire that covered a huge area in Boulder County. And so when you talk about complex trauma, then you're really looking at something that has a more interpersonal component to it. So it's not just an external event, but it's something that intrudes and violates you personally, your boundaries, your impression of yourself, and it usually has an ongoing duration. So, for instance, multiple incidents. So, like getting divorced can be very traumatic. I know when I was an outpatient psychotherapist for several years, that it definitely was a multiple year process of working through the divorce and the feelings, and there were repeated insults to each other. I mean, it was particularly painful for people. Things like a long term illness, like having cancer, again, would be a complex trauma. So that these are additional traumas on addition to what Mike was saying. And then we have, and this is like more related to what you were saying, Mike, of that we have things that seem minute that are really are big traumas. They seem innocuous, and yet they have a very big impact on us because we're vulnerable and to it for some reason. And usually it has to do with our own fears. So that there's the story of a client, and some of you may have heard me share this before, it's also in the book, of a client who came in because she was wanting to get married, and she had had trouble connecting with men. She hadn't dated much. She didn't feel attractive. And so when she had her REM session and we pulled the curtain back on what was the issue, she found herself standing in the fifth grade cafeteria line. And as she's standing in the cafeteria line, she goes, I don't know why I'm here. I don't remember anything. And I said, well, just be there. Let's see what happens. So she's standing there, and all of a sudden, a boy in her fifth grade walks up to her and says, you're ugly. Well, we've been fifth grade girls and we've been fifth grade boys. This is not like a really unusual experience. However, she was very vulnerable about how she looked. She was very concerned about her looks. And in that moment, her worst fear was confirmed, that she was unattractive. She was holding back the tears. They were running down her back of her throat. She wanted to crawl under the table. And that anchored, but it was forgotten. That's what happens with trauma. So now she's got this traumatic wound, but it now has been forgotten. So it's underground, which means it's gone beneath consciousness into the body. So it saved as body memory. So in this REM session, as that showed up, this boy was here, and so I gave her permission, go ahead and talk to him. And she brought in a safety figure to be with her. Her mother showed up, and she said to him, why did you say that? That really hurt my feelings. And when she looked out of his eyes to sense what he felt and what he wanted to say, he said, it's because I like you. Now, having been a parent for a fifth grade boy and girl at one time or another, this is very common for the boys that age to try and impress another by, being jabbing them. And but in that moment, her whole body memory of being unattractive regenerated. And within a few months, she met somebody she liked. And a year later, they got married, have 2 kids now. And I would say that never would have been uncovered. So she would have been working at all this surface level. So that what we're talking about with trauma is it goes underground. And that's what makes it really challenging, and what makes it harder to treat, has made it historically. REM is all about being able to go underground. So it's very effective with trauma.